Let's talk about the long-standing Latter-day Saint claim that Joseph Smith received a revelation concerning plural marriage as early as 1831. This last week, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints released a statement announcing that they had revised some of the supplemental materials to their scriptural text. Most notably, 25 section headings for the Doctrine and Covenants and 2 chapter headings for the Book of Mormon. Now, most of these changes, which they helpfully spell out in a number of graphs, are quite minor. It is true to say that these are just minor revisions, and thankfully they are based on the great research of the Joseph Smith Papers Project, which, if you know my channel, I am a big fan of. It's the best, most cutting edge and deeply researched resources out there. Some of those changes, I will add, do reflect the recently deceased Russell M. Nelson's emphasis on calling the church by its proper name. Maybe I will do an entire video on that topic at some point in the future. But I would wager that the most consequential change among this spread of revisions concerns Doctrine and Covenants 132. So on their chart where they lay out the number of different changes, if you go to D&C 132, it says it took out the words as early as 1831 and replaced it with earlier, which means that the heading used to read like this: Revelation given through Joseph Smith the prophet at Nauvoo, Illinois, recorded July 12, 1843, relating to the new and everlasting covenant, including the eternity of marriage covenant and the principle of plural marriage. Although the revelation was recorded in 1843, evidence indicates that some of the principles involved in this revelation were known by the prophet as early as 1831. Now that last sentence is revised to say that evidence indicates that some of the principles involved in this revelation were known by the prophet earlier. Now, the explanation given for this change is that, quote, this change indicates that there is some ambiguity about exactly when the principles in this revelation were revealed to the prophet. That's to put it mildly. So in this video, I want to talk about the broader story behind trying to identify the origins of Joseph Smith's theology of revelation, his theology of polygamy, especially as connected to a revelation, eventually D&C 132, why there is such a deep anxiety to connect it to 1831. Because I argue this is based on both a problematic historical source, it's based on a historical assumption, and it's based on a moral yearning for how to understand the origins of polygamy, and I will be dealing with each of those in turn. Let's dig in. I think it makes sense to start this video by providing a publication history of Doctrine and Covenants 132, how we got the text and how it has been framed. Now, I know there's been a lot of increased attention to these claims that I do not think are based on any historical validity, that Joseph Smith did not practice polygamy, that D&C 132 was actually a later creation. I'm in the early stages of putting together material to do an entire video on D&C 132, so I'm going to keep it brief here. But in short, Joseph Smith dictated the text that Latter-day Saints now refer to as Doctrine and Covenants 132 on July 12, 1843. The earliest copy that we have, and there is a rich textual history of this record, but the earliest copy we have, as far as the Joseph Smith Papers Project can tell, is in Joseph Kingsbury's hand. Here you have the first page, and I will link to it in the video description. It had an immediate reason for its creation. Hiram Smith was trying to get Joseph Smith to convince Emma of the practice, and Hiram believed that this text would do that cause. And then when that failed, he then used the text to try to convince the High Council, which again, he failed. And we have references to this text by the end of the year, several other people quoting it and referring to it. So I just want to make it clear. We know that this text dates from 1843, but after Joseph Smith is killed, the Mormons move out to Utah and they start practicing polygamy in public. Brigham Young announces it in 1852, and we get the first publication of it in a special issue of the Deseret News. Here you see that page from a special edition of Deseret News. I will link to it in the video description. It is officially added to the Doctrine and Covenants as a book of scripture in the 1876 edition by Orson Pratt, a name that you will hear again in this later on in this video. But the reference to principles of the revelation being received as early as 1831 is not present in the Deseret News publication in the 1876 edition, not even in the 1921 edition. That is not added until the 1981 edition, and it's likely in response to a number of LDS scholars who were trying to trace out the history of polygamy. And it included this introduction, which you'll note is a little different from even the 2013 version I mentioned before. It said, although the revelation was recorded in 1843, it is evident from the historical records that the doctrines and principles involved in this revelation had been known by the prophet since 1831. So that was the 1981 header to D&C 132, which is then softened in the 2013 edition, the version that I mentioned at the very start of this video that says that some of the principles involved may have been known, which is softening, walking a little way back from saying the doctrines and principles. And then, of course, it's revised further this year by removing as early as 1831 and now just saying earlier. So that's the background that should give some context to all this history I'm about to provide. By the way, if you enjoy this type of nerdy context, these deep dives into American religious and especially Mormon history, please make sure you're subscribed to this channel, like and share the videos so I can widen the reach of discussion, and if you want to give back, please consider becoming a member. I'm very, very grateful for all of you who have taken that plunge of becoming members. That's what allows me and my wonderful producer, Anthony, to continue dedicating our time to this channel. I try to do deep dives every Monday, connecting the past to the present every Wednesday, and then pull back the curtain to allow you to understand more of historical argumentation and historiography every Friday. But let's get back to polygamy and 1831. Now, one of the historical documents and claims that's often tethered to this broader story is a revelation that Joseph Smith allegedly dictated to William Phelps in 1831. This is an important and complicated enough topic that I want to bear down on it just a little bit to tease out the historical context so we can understand some of the problems associated with it. So, William Phelps was an early convert of the Latter-day Saint Church. He was a scribe for a lot of Joseph Smith's actions, activities, and revelations, and he did assist or go along with Joseph Smith to Independence, Missouri in the summer of 1831. Later, 3 decades later, so 1861, William Phelps writes out a letter to Brigham Young in which he writes out a revelation that he claims Joseph Smith had dictated back on that 1831 mission to independence. So, the revelation, according to Phelps, was dictated on July 17, 1831, and he narrates this in a letter that he wrote on August 12, 1861. And here's the first page from that letter, and I will link to the LDS Church Archives high-resolution images of the letter in the video description. This is the 4th verse from this alleged revelation. For it is my will that in time ye should take upon you wives of the Lamanites and Nephites, that their posterity may become white, delightsome, and just. For even now their females are more virtuous than the Gentiles. And then, so he goes on to narrate the entire revelation. And then he puts an addendum at the end. And this is what the addendum is. About 3 years after this was given, I asked Brother Joseph Smith Jr. privately how we were mentioned in the revelation could take wives from the natives, as we were all married men. And Joseph allegedly responded instantly in the same manner that Abraham and Jacob took plural wives by revelation. So that's the claim. Now, there is a lot of historical context that bears out portions of William Phelps's arguments. Phelps did accompany Joseph Smith on a trip to Independence in July of 1831. Much of the language in the revelation does sound familiar, but we don't get any other contemporary records from the 1830s that reference polygamy being taught, or especially being taught as part of the Native Americans, or just as part of LDS doctrine. And perhaps one of the most important elements to highlight is Phelps was not alone on this trip. There is also a figure named Ezra Booth, who would later leave the church and write a series of exposés as letters to local newspapers. And in one of those letters, a letter dated December 6, 1831, that was published in the December 8th issue of the Journal, which newspaper, which I will link to in the video description, we get a reference to a revelation referencing taking on Lamanite women as wives. So here's some of the main text. It has been made known by revelation that it will be pleasing to the Lord should they form a matrimonial alliance with the natives, and by this means the elders who comply with the things so pleasing to the Lord, and for which the Lord has promised to bless those who do it abundantly, gain a residence in Indian territory independent of the agent. Now, I should note, this was actually a very common practice in early America, to where these agents, these delegates going out to indigenous nations, would take on indigenous wives as a way to form these alliances. But it doesn't end there. This is what Booth says further. It has been made known to one who has left his wife in the state of New York that he is entirely free from his wife, and that he has a pleasure to take him a wife from among the Lamanites. It has easily perceived that this permission was perfectly suited to his desires. I have frequently heard from him, Joseph Smith, state that the Lord has made it known to him that he is free from his wife as any other woman, and the only crimes I have ever heard alleged against her is she is violently opposed to Mormonism. But before this contemplated marriage can be carried into effect, he must return to the state of New York and settle his business. In other words, he must go and get a divorce. So yes, they are talking about taking on native wives, but it was not as polygamous wives. Even in the sense of a common law divorce, they still had to go out and get that official divorce. So another point that many scholars have made is if Joseph Smith was teaching polygamy, including as part of the 1831 trip to the Native Americans and independence, Ezra Booth would have mentioned it. He would have made it as part of the expose, which is why that historical document, the William Phelps alleged revelation, does not really hold much water. The other historical argument typically trotted out to defend that Joseph Smith received a revelation on polygamy in 1831 relates to the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. Part of this is embedded within the D&C 130 text itself, because it's framed as you have asked me about how these ancient prophets like Abraham and Jacob had multiple wives. Well, here is the new and everlasting covenant. But that connection of polygamy to the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible is more of an assumption. It's more of a speculation. It's more of this ideological connection than anything that's actually rooted in the historical text. We don't get any historical documentation of Joseph Smith wrestling with polygamy during the time that he is working on the Joseph Smith translation. What we do have is plentiful historical documentation of others making that connection much later. One of the first to do so was none other than Orson Pratt, who I mentioned before, of course, the holder of the best beard in Mormon history, who delivered a sermon on October 7th, 1869, which I will link to in the video description, that said that Smith learned about the polygamy through revelation as part of his biblical studies, and he says that he claimed received many of these revelations as he was digging into the Bible. A couple of decades later, Andrew Jenson, who is an assistant church historian, more important than many other individuals in preserving Latter-day Saint history, publishes an essay in 1887 in which he quotes Joseph Noble, who was the brother of Louisa Beeman, one of Joseph Smith's plural wives in Nauvoo, recalling that Joseph Smith had allegedly told him that he learned about polygamy in 1831 as part of his Bible translation. I will include a link to that Andrew Jenson essay in the video description as well. And from that point on, you get a number of historical accounts from B.H. Roberts, from Andrew Jenson, from even external historians who are citing or making this connection of polygamy and the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. It would make sense that he's engulfed his life in these biblical patriarchs and he wants to copy them as well. Therefore, that's as good of a reason as any to see the origins of polygamy. What's noteworthy is that defense, that connection to 1831, does not make it into the header information for D&C 132. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the 1981 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, which just so happens to come after a decade of many Latter-day Saint historians who are also making that connection. So I think there is a tie there to where the LDS Church is trying to defend Joseph Smith receiving a revelation on polygamy for reasons I'm about to get into. Historians are providing that connection that he must have learned it while doing the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, and therefore we will insert that into the framing device. Because we need to, now coming to the conclusion of this video, talk about why Latter-day Saints are desperate to identify this 1831 revelation concerning plural marriage for Joseph Smith. Because there is a moral imperative to give both an early date and a clear instruction for Joseph Smith practicing polygamy. In other words, they need to affirm both a time and a purpose that justifies everything that comes later, especially in Kirtland, for those who believe that Joseph Smith took on Fanny Alger as a plural wife. Again, maybe a topic for a future video. I and some other historians don't see Fanny Alger as fitting into polygamy. It seems to fit more as just an affair or a connection. But if you see Fanny Alger as a plural wife, you want to have him being directed by the Lord before that, which is why you want that 1831 revelation. Or, for just the purpose of polygamy, you want polygamy to be rolled out in a very clear, logical, rational, and safe way. Because, as I've argued in my book, Kingdom of Nauvoo, and a number of other scholars have pointed out, the rollout of polygamy in Nauvoo, and I truly do believe that polygamy began in Nauvoo as part of a broader theological, cultural, political project that I called the Abraham Project in my book, that it was messy. There's a lot of harm done in how it was, and it does not really fit this image of a prophet receiving a clear directive that then you fill out. Instead, polygamy grows inconsistently. It evolves in unexpected ways in response to particular personalities or circumstances. In other words, polygamy cannot really be traced on a clear route from directive to action. But if you were to find a revelation point where Joseph Smith received a revelation as early as 1831, then that gives a post hoc approval for everything that followed later, a dynamic that I actually discussed in my previous YouTube video on the new Joseph Smith character Q&A page. So in other words, polygamy is really messy, but it would be a lot more cleaner if there was a clear revelation that preceded all that activity. So in conclusion, I think this new header revision is a good one. It's right. It reflects the broader modern scholarship that makes it clear you can't really tie a polygamy revelation to 1831, no matter how much people wish that were the case. The new header is also exceptionally vague, and I think by purpose. You can theoretically say, by saying that Joseph Smith received some of these principles of plural marriage earlier, that could still theoretically include an 1831 revelation. It could also theoretically include it not being practiced until Nauvoo. Why do they do this revision now? I have no idea. I don't have any insider access to that. I wonder if it's part of the broader discussions in response to the growing number of those who are skeptical that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy, that it's requiring the church to actually recognize what they can claim on safe ground and what is a bit more murky. Maybe it's in response to the wonderful scholarship by the Joseph Smith Papers Project and others who are like, hey, we really need to give up that 1831 date and be more responsible. I don't know. I think there's a variety of meanings, but I do think it reflects this long-standing anxiety over how we frame and date polygamy, because it says a lot, not just about how we interpret documents, not just about how we frame the past, but how we define prophetic authority and the character of Joseph Smith. I hope this video made sense. If so, hit the like button and share it with others. Subscribe to this channel if you enjoy this type of nerdy content. Watch out, I'm going to be doing a live video discussion on my YouTube channel coming up on November 5th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. I hope to see many of you there if you have questions, including on this video. This has been a fun community to start growing, and I'm so grateful to discuss these things with you because, as you know, history has never been more relevant than it is at the present, which is why we continue to struggle with it.